After my son died, I raised him alone. At 18, he built a 6'2" Manners app. Then she came back begging for forgiveness. When she realized she'd get nothing, she sent a lawyer. I panicked. Our lawyer said, we might lose. But my grandson just smiled and said, let her talk. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Philip and I'm 64 years old. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but some wounds need air to heal, and some truths demand to be spoken. 3 years ago, I buried my son Stanley. What I didn't expect was that I'd also lose my daughter-in-law that same week. Not to death, but to something far more cruel: abandonment. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening in October. Stanley was driving home from his job at the engineering firm, the same route he'd taken for 4 years. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit him head-on. The doctors said he died instantly, that he didn't suffer. I suppose that was meant to comfort me, but when you lose your only child, there's no comfort in the world that can fill that hole. Savannah was 7 months pregnant when we got the call. I remember racing to the hospital, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. When I arrived, she was sitting in the waiting room, staring at the wall with empty eyes. The nurses had already told her. We didn't speak much that night. What was there to say? Our world had just collapsed. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday morning. The church was packed with Stanley's friends, co-workers, and extended family. Savannah sat beside me in the front pew, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She seemed so fragile, so broken. I put my arm around her shoulders and whispered that we'd get through this together, that the baby would need both of us. She nodded, but something in her eyes felt distant, like she was already somewhere else. After the service, people came to the house. They brought casseroles and condolences, hugged us both, and told us how sorry they were. Savannah stayed in the bedroom most of the time, claiming she was tired. I understood. Grief hits everyone differently, and she was carrying Stanley's child. The stress couldn't be good for either of them. The first sign something was wrong came 3 days after the funeral. I knocked on her bedroom door around 10 in the morning with a cup of tea and some toast. She didn't answer, so I pushed the door open gently. The room was empty. Her suitcase was gone, along with most of her clothes. On the nightstand was a folded piece of paper with my name written on it in her careful handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Philip, it read. I can't do this. I can't stay in this house where everything reminds me of him. I can't raise his baby alone. I'm going to stay with my sister in California until I figure things out. Please don't try to find me. I need time to heal. It was signed simply, Savannah. I stood there for what felt like hours, reading those words over and over. She was 7 months pregnant with my grandchild, and she was just leaving? I called her cell phone immediately. It went straight to voicemail. I tried her sister's number, but it had been disconnected. I even drove to her old workplace, but they said she'd quit the week before Stanley died. That's when the panic set in. What about the baby? What about doctor's appointments? Prenatal care? What if something went wrong? I spent the next 2 weeks calling hospitals in California, checking with her few remaining friends, even hiring a private investigator. Nothing. It was like she had vanished into thin air. Then on a Thursday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Stanley's funeral, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find a young nurse holding a baby carrier. My heart stopped. Inside was the tiniest, most perfect little boy I'd ever seen, but something was wrong with his eyes. They didn't track movement the way they should. Are you Philip Morrison? The nurse asked. When I nodded, she handed me an envelope along with a bag of baby supplies. This was left at our hospital yesterday with instructions to bring him here. The mother said family complications prevented her from caring for him. Family complications. That's what she called abandoning her newborn son. The letter inside was brief and clinical. Savannah explained that the baby had been born with a condition called cortical visual impairment, essentially meaning he was legally blind. The doctors said it might improve with therapy, but there were no guarantees. She couldn't handle raising a disabled child while grieving Stanley. She thought I'd be better equipped to give him what he needed. I looked down at this tiny human being, Stanley's son, my grandson, sleeping peacefully despite being thrown away by his own mother. In that moment, something crystallized inside me. This child might be blind, but he wasn't broken, and he sure as hell wasn't unwanted. Not by me. I named him after his father, Stanley Philip Morrison, Little Stanley. From that day forward, it was just the two of us against the world. The first months were brutal. I hadn't raised a baby in 35 years, and this wasn't just any baby. Stanley needed special care, constant attention, and medical appointments I couldn't afford. I sold my car and took the bus everywhere. I learned about visual stimulation therapy, worked with specialists, and spent every penny of my retirement savings on treatments that might help him see. But you know what? He was perfect. Even blind, even abandoned, even starting life with every disadvantage you could imagine. Stanley was absolutely perfect. When he was 6 months old, he started turning his head toward my voice with the biggest smile. By his first birthday, he was crawling and exploring everything with his tiny hands. The doctors said his other senses were compensating beautifully for his vision. I never heard from Savannah again. Not a phone call, not a letter, not even a birthday card. It was like she had erased us from her life completely. Sometimes I wondered if she ever thought about the son she'd thrown away, but mostly I tried not to think about her at all. Stanley and I had each other, and that was enough. What I didn't know then was that in 18 years she'd come crawling back, and when she did, she'd discover that the blind baby she'd abandoned had become something extraordinary. Raising Stanley alone wasn't just difficult, it was like learning to breathe underwater while climbing a mountain. Every day brought new challenges I never could have imagined, but every small victory felt like conquering the world. When Stanley turned 2, the specialists recommended we start intensive therapy sessions. 3 times a week, we'd take 2 buses across town to a clinic that specialized in visual impairment. The sessions cost $120 each, and my insurance covered exactly none of it. I started working nights at a warehouse to pay for them, sleeping maybe 4 hours between getting home and Stanley waking up. The other parents at the clinic looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Most children came with both parents, or at least mothers who seemed to have their lives together. Here I was, a 66-year-old man fumbling with diaper bags and baby bottles, dark circles under my eyes, wearing the same 3 shirts in rotation because laundry was just another thing I hadn't figured out yet. But Stanley was thriving. His therapist, Maria, was a godsend. She taught me how to create a safe environment for him to explore, how to use sound and texture to help him navigate the world. By age 3, Stanley could find his way around our small apartment with startling confidence. He'd memorized the number of steps between his bedroom and the kitchen, knew exactly where every piece of furniture sat. What amazed me most was his curiosity. While other kids his age were glued to television screens, Stanley was fascinated by sounds, textures, and patterns he could feel. He'd spend hours running his fingers over different fabrics, listening to music with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young. When I'd read to him, which was every single night, he'd interrupt to ask questions about words, about how stories worked, about why people made the choices they did. The hardest part wasn't the medical bills or the sleepless nights, it was the loneliness. My friends from work had retired and moved away. My brother lived across the country and called maybe twice a year. Stanley's other grandparents, Savannah's parents, had cut all contact the moment she disappeared. As far as they were concerned, if their daughter couldn't handle raising the baby, why should they be involved? So it was just us, Stanley and me, figuring it out day by day. When he turned 4, I realized we needed to start thinking about school. The public school system offered special education programs, but after visiting several classrooms, I knew they weren't right for Stanley. The teachers meant well, but they seemed to focus more on what the children couldn't do rather than what they could accomplish. That's when I discovered the Henderson Academy, a private school 45 minutes away that specialized in educating gifted children with disabilities. The principal, Mrs. Crawford, spent 2 hours with Stanley during his evaluation. She had him solve puzzles, answer complex questions, and demonstrate his remarkable memory. When we finished, she pulled me aside. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "your grandson is exceptional. His cognitive abilities are far above average even for children his age. But I have to be honest, our tuition is $8,000 per semester." $8,000? I made $12,000 a year at the warehouse. The math was impossible, but looking at Stanley's eager face as he explored their sensory learning room, I knew I had to find a way. I sold everything that wasn't nailed down. Stanley's father's tools, my late wife's jewelry, furniture I'd inherited from my parents. I took out a loan against the small life insurance policy Stanley had left behind. I picked up weekend shifts cleaning office buildings. For 2 years, I worked 7 days a week, sleeping maybe 5 hours a night, living on peanut butter sandwiches and whatever was on sale at the grocery store. But Stanley flourished at Henderson Academy. His teachers recognized immediately that his blindness wasn't a limitation. It was just a different way of processing the world. They introduced him to Braille, to computer programs that converted text to speech, to adaptive technologies I'd never dreamed existed. More importantly, they nurtured his natural gifts. Stanley had an incredible memory and an intuitive understanding of patterns and systems. By age 6, he was reading chapter books in Braille. By 7, he was solving math problems that challenged kids twice his age. His teachers started using words like gifted and prodigy. At home, Stanley began showing interest in our old computer, a second-hand machine I'd bought him for educational games. But instead of playing games, he wanted to understand how the computer worked. He'd sit for hours listening to the sounds it made, asking me to describe what was happening on the screen. When I couldn't answer his increasingly complex questions, he began researching on his own using text-to-speech software. By age 10, Stanley was teaching himself programming languages. I'd find him at the computer at 6 in the morning, having woken up early to work on projects I couldn't begin to understand. He'd try to explain them to me, something about making computers more accessible for people with disabilities, but most of it went over my head. What I did understand was that my grandson, the baby his mother had abandoned for being imperfect, was extraordinary. The other thing I understood was that Savannah had no idea what she'd thrown away. In all those years, through every milestone and achievement, I never heard a word from her. No birthday cards, no Christmas presents, no awkward phone calls asking how he was doing. It was like Stanley simply didn't exist in her world. Sometimes, late at night when I was balancing the checkbook and trying to figure out how to pay for Stanley's next semester, I'd wonder what she was doing. Had she remarried? Did she have other children? Did she ever think about the son she'd abandoned? But mostly I tried not to think about her at all. Stanley and I had built something beautiful together, a bond forged by necessity but strengthened by genuine love and respect. He was my purpose, my pride, my reason for getting up every morning. I just never imagined that one day she'd come back wanting a piece of what we'd built. Stanley was 15 when he created his first real application, a program that helped blind students navigate online educational resources. His computer science teacher at Henderson Academy was so impressed, she submitted it to a national competition for young innovators. Stanley won first place and a scholarship to a summer program at MIT. That's when I knew our quiet life was about to change forever. The summer Stanley spent at MIT changed everything. He came home buzzing with ideas and concepts that made my head spin, talking about artificial intelligence and accessibility technology with the confidence of someone twice his age. But more than that, he came back with a vision. "Grandpa," he said one evening as we sat in our tiny living room, "I want to create something that will help people like me navigate the world better. Not just computers, but everything. Restaurants, stores, public transportation. There has to be a way to use technology to level the playing field." I listened as he outlined his idea for an application that would use smartphone cameras and artificial intelligence to describe surroundings in real time for visually impaired users. The phone would identify objects, read signs aloud, recognize faces, even detect obstacles and suggest safe walking paths. It sounded like science fiction to me, but Stanley spoke about it like it was inevitable. The problem was, developing this kind of technology required resources we simply didn't have. Stanley needed better computer equipment, access to specialized software, and potentially a team of developers to help bring his vision to life. We were still living paycheck to paycheck, and I was already working myself to exhaustion just to keep him in school. That's when Stanley surprised me again. During his junior year at Henderson Academy, he entered his preliminary app concept into a national high school entrepreneurship competition. I didn't even know he'd submitted it until Mrs. Crawford called to tell me he'd been selected as one of 10 finalists nationwide. The competition took place in Chicago over a long weekend in March. Stanley had to present his idea to a panel of technology executives and venture capitalists, demonstrating not just the concept, but also a working prototype he'd somehow managed to develop using our ancient home computer. I'd never been so nervous in my life. Here was my 17-year-old grandson who'd never been on an airplane before, about to pitch his idea to some of the most successful people in the technology industry. I sat in the audience watching him navigate the stage with his white cane, his presentation slides designed specifically for audio description, and I felt a mixture of pride and terror. Stanley's presentation was flawless. He explained the problem, that there were over 7 million visually impaired people in the United States alone, most of whom struggled with basic navigation and independence. He demonstrated his prototype app, showing how it could identify objects, read text, and provide spatial awareness through audio cues. But what really impressed the judges was when he talked about the business model and scalability. "This isn't just about helping blind people," he said, his voice steady and confident. "This technology has applications for elderly users, people with cognitive disabilities, anyone who needs enhanced environmental awareness. The potential market is enormous and the social impact is immeasurable." When they announced the winners, Stanley took first place. The prize was $50,000 in seed funding and mentorship from industry professionals. I watched my grandson accept that award, and for the first time since his birth, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything we'd been through had been worth it. The months following the competition were a whirlwind. Stanley used the prize money to upgrade his equipment and hire 2 college students to help with programming. Our living room became a makeshift office filled with computers, cables, and the constant sound of typing and quiet conversations about code optimization. Stanley's mentor from the competition, a successful app developer named David Chen, became a regular presence in our lives. He'd video call with Stanley twice a week, reviewing progress and offering guidance on everything everything from user interface design to patent applications. Watching them work together, I realized that Stanley had outgrown everything I could teach him about technology. He was operating in a world I couldn't even comprehend. But the most remarkable thing was how Stanley managed to balance this intense development work with finishing high school. His grades never slipped, and he was accepted to several top-tier universities with full scholarships. When Harvard offered him early admission to their computer science program, I thought surely he'd accept immediately. Instead, Stanley surprised me again. "I want to defer for a year," he told me. "The app is almost ready for launch, and I think we have a real chance to make something special happen. College will always be there, but this opportunity might not." By his 18th birthday, Stanley's app, which he'd named Pathfinder, was ready for public release. The beta testing had been overwhelmingly positive, with users reporting dramatic improvements in their daily independence and mobility. Tech blogs were starting to take notice, and several major technology companies had reached out expressing interest. That's when David Chen introduced Stanley to Rebecca Martinez, a venture capitalist who specialized in accessibility technology investments. Rebecca flew in from Silicon Valley to meet with Stanley in person, and I'll never forget sitting in our cramped living room while she outlined what she saw as Pathfinder's potential. "Stanley," she said, "what you've created here isn't just an app, it's a paradigm shift. You're not just helping people adapt to the world as it exists. You're showing how technology can make the world adapt to people with different needs. The commercial applications are staggering." She offered Stanley two options. He could license the technology to a major tech company for a guaranteed $2 million, or he could accept her venture capital investment and retain ownership while scaling the business himself. The investment option was riskier but potentially much more lucrative. Stanley asked for a week to think about it. That evening, we sat on our tiny balcony overlooking the parking lot of our apartment complex, and I asked him what he was leaning toward. "The safe choice would be to take the licensing deal," he said thoughtfully. $2 million would change our lives completely. You could retire, we could buy a real house, I could go to college without worrying about money." "But," I prompted, "but I didn't create Pathfinder just to make money, Grandpa. I created it to help people like me live better lives. If I license it to a big company, I lose control over how it develops, how it's marketed, who has access to it. They might focus on profit over impact." 3 days later, Stanley accepted Rebecca's investment offer. She invested $3 million for a 30% stake in Pathfinder Technologies, valuing Stanley's company at $10 million on paper. At 18 years old, my grandson was officially a millionaire. The next 6 months were unlike anything I could have imagined. Stanley hired a small team of developers and moved operations to a real office space downtown. Pathfinder launched publicly in September and was featured in major technology publications within weeks. The App Store rankings soared, and downloads reached 6 figures within the first month. But the real validation came from the users. Stanley received hundreds of emails from visually impaired people describing how Pathfinder had transformed their daily lives. Parents wrote about their children gaining independence they never thought possible. Elderly users who'd lost vision later in life wrote about feeling confident leaving their homes again. By December, just 3 months after launch, major technology companies were circling with acquisition offers. Google offered $45 million. Apple offered $52 million. Facebook's offer reached $60 million. Stanley turned them all down. "It's not about the money," he explained to me one evening as we reviewed the offers together. "These companies want to acquire Pathfinder to integrate it into their existing platforms, which means they control access and pricing. I want Pathfinder to remain independent and affordable for the people who need it most." That's when Rebecca introduced Stanley to Marcus Webb, the CEO of a private equity firm that specialized in scaling technology companies while maintaining their mission-driven focus. Marcus offered a different kind of deal. His firm would provide additional capital and business expertise to help Stanley expand Pathfinder globally, but Stanley would retain majority control and decision-making authority. The negotiation process took weeks, with lawyers and accountants reviewing every detail. Finally, in January, just 7 months after Pathfinder's launch, Stanley signed an agreement that valued his company at $85 million. He sold a 25% stake for $21 million, keeping 75% ownership for himself. $21 million. I kept staring at that number, trying to process what it meant. The baby that Savannah had abandoned because he was too damaged to be worth raising had just become one of the youngest multimillionaires in the country, but Stanley remained exactly the same person he'd always been. Thoughtful, driven, compassionate, and utterly focused on using his gifts to help others. The only difference was that now he had the resources to dream even bigger. What neither of us realized was that our sudden wealth had attracted attention from someone we'd both tried very hard to forget. Savannah had been watching from the shadows, and she was about to make her presence known in the most devastating way possible. The doorbell rang on a Tuesday morning in February, exactly 18 years and 4 months after Savannah had abandoned Stanley at our doorstep. I remember the date precisely because it was the day after Stanley had been featured on the cover of Tech Innovation magazine as Young Entrepreneur of the Year. I wasn't expecting anyone. Stanley was at his office downtown, probably in back-to-back meetings with developers and investors. I'd been enjoying a rare, quiet morning, reading the newspaper and marveling at how far we'd come from those desperate early days when every dollar mattered. I opened the door and felt the blood drain from my face. Standing on our new front porch, we'd bought a modest house in a better neighborhood once Stanley's success became undeniable, was Savannah. But this wasn't the frightened, overwhelmed young woman who'd fled all those years ago. This was someone entirely different. She looked polished, expensive. Her hair was professionally styled, her clothes clearly costly, her makeup flawless. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never struggled a day in her life. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold. They held a calculating intelligence that I didn't remember from before. "Hello, Philip," she said, her voice smooth and warm, like we'd just spoken yesterday instead of nearly 2 decades ago. "You look wonderful. Success suits you." I stood there for a moment, my hand gripping the doorframe so tightly my knuckles went white. Of all the scenarios I'd imagined over the years, and believe me, I'd imagined plenty, this calm, confident appearance wasn't one of them. "What do you want, Savannah?" My voice came out rougher than I intended. Her smile never wavered. "May I come in? I think we have a lot to discuss." Every instinct I had screamed at me to slam the door in her face, but curiosity won out. I needed to know why she was here, what she thought she could possibly say after 18 years of silence. I stepped aside and let her enter. She walked through the house slowly, taking in the tasteful furniture, the large windows, the obvious signs of our improved circumstances. When she reached the living room, she paused at the mantelpiece, studying the photos displayed there. Stanley's graduation, his magazine covers, pictures of us at various award ceremonies. "He's grown into such a handsome young man," she said softly, picking up a recent photo. "He has Stanley's eyes, doesn't he? His father's determination." "Put that down." My voice was deadly quiet. She replaced the photo carefully, then turned to face me with what appeared to be genuine emotion shining in her eyes. "Philip, I know you must hate me. I know what I did was unforgivable, but I need you to understand I was broken when Stanley died. Completely shattered. I couldn't think clearly, couldn't function. The doctor said the baby might never see, and I panicked. You abandoned him." The words came out like bullets. "You abandoned your own child because he wasn't perfect enough for you." Tears began sliding down her cheeks, and for a moment, she looked like the vulnerable young woman I remembered. I was 24 years old, Philip. I'd never dealt with anything like grief before, and suddenly, I was supposed to raise a disabled child alone. I wasn't strong enough, I wasn't brave enough, but you were. She sat down on our couch without invitation, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she'd pulled from her purse. "I made the worst mistake of my life walking away from my son. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about him. Don't wonder what he's become. Don't hate myself for being such a coward." I remained standing, my arms crossed, fighting the urge to physically remove her from my house. "And yet somehow you managed to stay away for 18 years. Funny how maternal instinct works." "I was ashamed," she whispered. "As the years went by, I became more and more convinced that you and Stanley were better off without me. I told myself I'd done the right thing, giving him to someone who could provide what he needed. But seeing him in the magazines, reading about his success, Philip, I'm so proud of what you've helped him become. What we've built together," I corrected sharply. "You had nothing to do with it." She nodded quickly. "You're absolutely right. You raised him, you sacrificed for him, you believed in him when no one else would. I'm not here to take credit for any of that. Then why are you here?" Savannah took a shaky breath, and when she looked up at me, her expression had shifted slightly. There was still vulnerability there, but underneath it, I caught a glimpse of something harder. "I want to be part of his life, Philip. I want to try to build a relationship with my son. I know I don't deserve it, I know I'll have to earn it, but I have to try. I've spent 18 years regretting my decision, and I can't spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. He doesn't need you." The words came out flat and final. "He's never needed you. We've done just fine on our own." "I'm sure you have," she said, and now there was definitely steel in her voice. "But I'm still his mother, Philip. Legally and biologically, I have rights. I'm not looking to disrupt his life or take him away from you. I just want a chance to explain myself, to apologize, to maybe have some small part in his future." That's when I understood. This wasn't about maternal love or regret or second chances. This was about money. Stanley's success had attracted her attention like blood attracts sharks, and she wanted her piece of the pie. "He's 18, I said carefully. "If he wants to have a relationship with you, that's his choice to make, but I won't pressure him either way." She smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "That's all I'm asking for. Just a chance." We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. I studied her face, trying to reconcile this polished, confident woman with the broken girl who'd fled after Stanley's funeral. She'd clearly done well for herself in the intervening years. Her clothes, her car parked outside, even her dental work suggested significant financial resources. "What have you been doing all this time?" I asked finally. "I remarried," she said simply. "Richard Caldwell, he's a cardiologist in Seattle. We have 2 daughters together. Emma's 14 and Sophie's 12. They're both honors students, very accomplished. So she'd had other children. She'd been capable of raising kids after all, just not the one who needed her most." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "Richard doesn't know about Stanley," she continued. "I told him I'd never been married before, never had children. Starting fresh seemed like the only way to move forward. You lied to your husband about having a son." She flinched slightly. "I protected my family from a painful truth that couldn't change anything. Stanley was gone from my life. Telling Richard wouldn't have brought him back. But now that Stanley's worth millions, suddenly you remember you have a son." Her mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold flash across her features. "That's not fair, Philip. Yes, I've seen the articles about his success, and yes, I'm proud of what he's accomplished, but that's not why I'm here, isn't it?" She stood up abruptly, smoothing her skirt with hands that weren't quite steady. "I can see this was a mistake. You're determined to think the worst of me, which I suppose I deserve. But I'm not going away, Philip. Stanley is my son, and I have every right to contact him directly if I choose to." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. She was giving me the courtesy of going through me first, but she'd bypass me entirely if necessary. "I'll talk to him," I said finally. "I'll tell him you came by and what you said. What he decides to do with that information is up to him." She smiled again, that calculating expression I was beginning to recognize. "Thank you. That's all I wanted." She pulled a business card from her purse and set it on the coffee table. "My contact information in case he wants to reach out." I walked her to the door in silence. As she reached the threshold, she turned back one more time. "Philip, I want you to know that despite everything, I'm grateful. You gave Stanley a life I never could have provided, and you clearly love him as much as any parent could. I'm not here to replace you or take anything away from what you've built together." "Good," I said, "because you couldn't if you tried." She was already walking toward her car when she called back over her shoulder. "I really do hope he'll see me. I have so much I want to tell him about his father, about our time together. Stanley deserves to know where he came from." After she drove away, I sat in my living room for over an hour, staring at her business card and trying to process what had just happened. Savannah Caldwell, it read. Interior design consultant, a Seattle address and phone number. When Stanley came home that evening, I told him everything. He listened without interruption, his expression unreadable behind his dark glasses. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "What do you think I should do, Grandpa?" he asked finally. "I think," I said carefully, "that she's not the same person who left you 18 years ago, and I'm not sure that's a good thing." Stanley decided to meet with Savannah. Against every instinct I had, against every warning bell going off in my head, he chose to give his biological mother the chance she claimed she wanted. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop downtown where they could talk privately. I offered to go with him, but Stanley insisted he needed to handle this alone. "I'm 18, Grandpa," he said with that quiet determination I'd come to know so well. "If I'm going to have any kind of relationship with her, it has to start with just the 2 of us." I spent that entire Saturday afternoon pacing our living room, checking my phone every few minutes, imagining worst-case scenarios. When Stanley finally came home 3 hours later, his expression was troubled, but not devastated. "How did it go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Stanley sat down heavily on the couch, removing his dark glasses and rubbing his eyes, something he only did when he was deeply stressed. "She's not what I expected," he said slowly. "She seems genuinely sorry about leaving, and she knows a lot about Dad that I've never heard before. Stories about their college years, about how excited he was when she got pregnant, about the plans they'd made. But there's something off about her, Grandpa. She asked a lot of questions about Pathfinder, about my finances, about what my plans are for the company." She kept steering the conversation toward money and business even when I tried to talk about more personal things. My stomach clenched. "What kind of questions?" "Whether I have a will, whether there are other investors besides Rebecca's firm, what would happen to my shares if something happened to me." She framed it as concern for my well-being, but it felt more like reconnaissance. Over the next few weeks, Savannah became a regular presence in Stanley's life. They met for coffee twice a week, and she started sending him long emails filled with memories of his father and expressions of regret about their lost time together. To an outside observer, it might have looked like a mother and son slowly rebuilding their relationship. But I saw the signs that Stanley was missing. Savannah never visited our house again after that first day. She never asked about Stanley's childhood, about the struggles we'd faced together, about the milestones she'd missed. Her interest seemed entirely focused on his current success and future prospects. More troubling, she began introducing ideas that clearly weren't her own. Suggestions about estate planning, about the importance of family legacy, about how successful people needed to think carefully about inheritance and succession. When I pointed out to Stanley that these conversations seemed oddly sophisticated for someone who claimed to have been racked with guilt for 18 years, he just shrugged. Maybe she's been thinking about these things because she regrets not being part of my life, he said. Maybe she wants to make sure she doesn't miss anything else important. The breaking point came 6 weeks after their first meeting. Stanley came home from one of their coffee dates looking shaken in a way I hadn't seen since he was a small child. She wants me to add her to my emergency contacts, he said without preamble, and she thinks I should update my will to include her as a beneficiary. I felt my blood pressure spike. She said that directly? Not exactly. She said that family should look out for each other, and that she'd hate for anything to happen to me without us having, how did she put it, properly established our relationship legally. She said it was just about making sure she could be notified if there was ever an emergency. Stanley, I said carefully, you understand that if you're listed as having no immediate family other than me, and something happens to both of us, your assets would go to the state. But if she's legally recognized as your mother and listed in your will, she'd inherit everything. Stanley's voice was flat. I know, Grandpa. I'm not stupid. I never said you were, but you are trusting, and she's counting on that. That evening, Stanley called Savannah and told her he needed more time to think about formalizing their relationship. Her response, according to Stanley, was understanding but tinged with disappointment. She hoped he wouldn't wait too long, she said, because family connections were precious and life was unpredictable. 2 days later, we received a certified letter from Pemberton Williams & Associates, a law firm in Seattle. My hand shook as I opened it, already knowing it couldn't be good news. The letter was formal and intimidating, full of legal language that made my head spin. But the essential message was clear. Savannah Caldwell was asserting her parental rights and demanding recognition as Stanley's legal next of kin. She was also requesting a formal accounting of Stanley's assets and business interests, claiming concern for her son's welfare and financial security. This is a shakedown, I told Stanley as we sat in our lawyer's office the next morning. She's trying to force her way into your life and your business. Our attorney, James Fletcher, was a kind man in his 60s who'd helped us with the initial paperwork when Stanley started Pathfinder. But corporate law was very different from family law, and he looked as overwhelmed as I felt. Technically, he said, studying the letter through his reading glasses, she does have parental rights. She never formally relinquished custody, and there's no record of abandonment charges being filed. From a legal standpoint, she's still Stanley's mother. But she left him, I protested. She abandoned a newborn baby. That may be morally reprehensible, but proving legal abandonment after 18 years, especially when she can claim she was suffering from postpartum depression and grief. It's complicated. Stanley sat quietly through this exchange, his face impassive. Finally, he spoke. What exactly is she asking for? James consulted the letter again. Recognition as your legal parent, inclusion in medical and financial decision-making processes, and what they're calling transparency regarding your business interests and estate planning. They're not directly asking for money, but they're positioning her to have legal standing if something were to happen to you. And if we refuse? They're threatening a custody suit, which is absurd since you're 18. But they could also file for guardianship if they claim you're being unduly influenced or if your grandfather is declared incompetent to make decisions on your behalf. I felt the room spin slightly. They can do that? It's a stretch. But with enough money behind it, they could make your lives very difficult. Long court battles, frozen assets, negative publicity that could hurt Stanley's business. That afternoon, we met with Margaret Chen, a family law specialist, recommended by Rebecca Martinez. Margaret was sharp, no nonsense, and clearly unimpressed by Savannah's legal maneuvering. This is classic predatory behavior, she said bluntly after reviewing the case. The timing isn't coincidental. She's targeting Stanley now that he's financially successful. But the problem is legally, she does have parental rights that were never formally terminated. So what are our options? Stanley asked. We fight it. We document her abandonment, we challenge her motives, and we make it clear that this is about money, not family reunion. But I'll be honest with you, it's going to be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining, and there's no guarantee we'll win. The legal bills started immediately. Within a week, we'd paid Margaret's firm $15,000 in retainer fees, and that was just the beginning. Savannah's lawyers were clearly well-funded and aggressive, filing motion after motion that required responses, depositions, and expert testimony. Stanley's business began to suffer as he spent more time in lawyers' offices than in meetings with developers and investors. The stress was affecting his sleep, his concentration, and his usually unshakable confidence. I watched my grandson, the young man who'd overcome every obstacle life had thrown at him, begin to doubt himself for the first time. Maybe I should just give her what she wants, he said one evening after a particularly brutal deposition. Maybe it would be easier to include her in my will and be done with it. Stanley, I said firmly, if you give in to this, it won't end. She'll keep coming back for more. People like Savannah see generosity as weakness, and they exploit it. But what if she's right? What if I am being unfair? She is my biological mother, and she did lose her husband. She made her choice 18 years ago, I reminded him. She chose to walk away when you needed her most. You don't owe her anything now just because you've become successful. The turning point came during Stanley's second deposition, when Savannah's lead attorney, a shark named William Pemberton, made a crucial mistake. He pushed too hard, asking questions that revealed more about his client's motivations than he intended. "Mr. Morrison," Pemberton said, "don't you think your grandfather has poisoned you against your mother? Isn't it possible that his resentment has clouded your judgment about giving her a rightful place in your life?" Stanley was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned slightly toward where he knew the court reporter was sitting. "For the record," he said clearly, "my grandfather never spoke against my mother. He told me the facts of what happened, but he never tried to influence my feelings about her. Any resentment I have toward Savannah Caldwell is based entirely on her own actions and words. But surely you can understand her position," Pemberton pressed. "She lost her husband. She was grieving. She made a mistake she's regretted ever since." "If she regretted it," Stanley said quietly, "she had 18 years to contact me. She had 18 years to send a birthday card, to ask how I was doing, to show any interest in my well-being. The only reason she's here now is because I'm worth millions of dollars. If Pathfinder had failed, if I was still struggling financially, do you really think she'd be fighting for parental rights?" Pemberton's face flushed red. "That's speculation and irrelevant too." "Actually," Stanley interrupted, "I think it's the most relevant thing in this entire case." That evening, Margaret called with surprising news. "Stanley's deposition went better than I hoped," she said. "But more importantly, we've been doing some digging into Savannah's background and we found something interesting." My pulse quickened. "What kind of something?" "She's not as financially stable as she appears. Her husband, Richard Caldwell, is heavily in debt from a malpractice lawsuit, and their house is facing foreclosure. Her interior design business is failing, and she's borrowed against her daughter's college funds. This isn't about family reunification. This is about financial desperation." For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. But I also felt something darker, the anticipation of watching someone who'd tried to destroy us get exactly what they deserved. "Can we use this information?" Stanley asked. Margaret's smile was sharp as a blade. "Oh, we're going to use every bit of it." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, but the tension inside it felt enormous. After 3 months of legal warfare, everything was coming down to this final hearing. Judge Patricia Williams sat behind her bench, reviewing the mountain of documents both sides had submitted. Savannah sat at the plaintiff's table with her high-powered legal team, looking every inch the grieving mother seeking justice. Stanley and I sat with Margaret, and I could feel the weight of 18 years of struggle and sacrifice hanging in the balance. What Savannah and her lawyers didn't know was that Stanley had been planning for this moment longer than any of us realized. During the weeks of depositions and legal maneuvering, while everyone thought he was cracking under pressure, Stanley had actually been setting a trap that was about to snap shut. Judge Williams looked up from her papers and addressed the room. "This is an unusual case involving parental rights, alleged abandonment, and questions of financial motivation. I've reviewed all submitted evidence, and I'm ready to hear final arguments." Pemberton stood first, launching into an emotional speech about maternal bonds, postpartum depression, and second chances. He painted Savannah as a young woman who'd made a tragic mistake during the worst period of her life, but who had spent 18 years regretting that decision and hoping for reconciliation. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with synthetic sincerity, "my client isn't seeking to disrupt the loving relationship between Stanley and his grandfather. She simply wants recognition of the biological reality that she is his mother and the legal protections that relationship entails. Is it wrong for a mother to want to ensure her son's welfare and security?" When Margaret stood for our side, her approach was completely different. "Your Honor, this case isn't about parental rights or family reunification. It's about financial opportunism, pure and simple. Ms. Caldwell abandoned her newborn son because he was born with a disability she didn't want to deal with. She stayed away for 18 years, through every milestone, every struggle, every achievement. She only resurfaced when that same son became worth millions of dollars." Margaret presented the evidence of Savannah's financial troubles, her lies to her current husband about Stanley's existence, and the suspicious timing of her sudden maternal instincts. But I could see Judge Williams wasn't entirely convinced. Legally, Savannah still had parental rights, and proving her motivations were purely financial was difficult. That's when Stanley asked to address the court directly. "Your Honor," he said, rising from his chair with his characteristic quiet confidence, "I'd like to present some additional evidence that I believe is relevant to this case." Pemberton immediately objected. "Your Honor, the discovery period is closed. No new evidence can be introduced at this stage." Judge Williams looked intrigued. "What kind of evidence, Mr. Morrison?" Stanley reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small digital recording device. "Audio recording recordings of private conversations, Your Honor. Conversations that reveal Ms. Caldwell's true motivations and intentions. The courtroom erupted. Pemberton was on his feet, shouting about illegal wiretapping and inadmissible evidence. Savannah had gone completely white, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Margaret looked as surprised as everyone else. This wasn't something Stanley had discussed with our legal team. Order, Judge Williams banged her gavel. Mr. Morrison, explain how these recordings were obtained. Stanley's voice remained calm and steady. I made them myself, Your Honor, with a device I wore during my meetings with Ms. Caldwell. In this state, only one party needs to consent to recording a conversation, and I was that party. I began recording after our third meeting, when I became suspicious of her true motives. Judge Williams considered this. I'll allow the recordings, but only if they're directly relevant to the question of Ms. Caldwell's motivations and fitness as a parent. Stanley nodded and activated the device. Savannah's voice filled the courtroom, and what we heard was devastating. The first recording was from their fifth meeting, where Savannah could be heard coaching Stanley on estate planning. You're so young, sweetheart. You probably haven't thought about what would happen if something unexpected occurred, but successful people like you need to plan for every possibility. Family should always come first in these decisions. The second recording was even more damning. Savannah discussing Stanley's business with someone on the phone, presumably her husband, while she thought Stanley was in the restroom. The kid's worth at least $60 million on paper, probably more, she said. If we can establish legal standing, we'll be set for life. Richard, this could solve all our problems. But the third recording was the nuclear bomb that destroyed any sympathy she might have had left. It was Savannah talking to someone, her lawyer, we later learned, about contingency plans. If the parental rights angle doesn't work, her voice said clearly, what about claiming he's mentally incompetent? I mean, he's blind. He's never had a normal social life. He's been isolated with that old man his whole life. We could argue that he lacks the capacity to make sound financial decisions and needs a guardian. The courtroom was dead silent when the recording ended. Savannah was crying, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of someone whose carefully constructed facade had just crumbled completely. Judge Williams looked at Savannah with undisguised disgust. Ms. Caldwell, these recordings suggest that your interest in your son is entirely financial and that you were prepared to have him declared incompetent to gain control of his assets. Do you have any response to this evidence? Pemberton tried to salvage the situation, claiming the recordings were taken out of context, that his client was simply exploring all legal options available to her, but the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. Stanley wasn't finished. Your Honor, I'd also like the court to know that I've conducted my own investigation into Ms. Caldwell's background and current circumstances. He proceeded to detail everything we'd learned and more. Savannah's mounting debts, her husband's malpractice troubles, her failing business, and most damning of all, evidence that she'd attempted similar financial schemes with wealthy elderly clients of her interior design business. I found records of at least 3 instances where Ms. Caldwell developed close relationships with wealthy clients, convinced them to include her in their wills, and then inherited substantial sums when they died under suspicious circumstances. The pattern is consistent with what she's attempting here. Pemberton was frantically objecting, but Judge Williams silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. Mr. Morrison, the judge said, you mentioned earlier that you began recording these conversations after your third meeting. What made you suspicious at that point? Stanley turned slightly in Savannah's direction, though of course he couldn't see her. She never once asked about my childhood, Your Honor, never asked about my disability, about how I learned to navigate the world, about what school was like, about my friends or interests or dreams. The only thing she ever wanted to discuss was my current success and my future plans. A real mother would want to know about the 18 years she missed. A financial predator only cares about the money. Judge Williams was quiet for a long moment, reviewing her notes. When she finally spoke, her voice was ice cold. Ms. Caldwell, I find your behavior in this case to be morally reprehensible and legally frivolous. The evidence clearly shows that your interest in your son is purely financial, and your willingness to have him declared incompetent to access his assets demonstrates a callous disregard for his well-being that is antithetical to any parental relationship. She continued, furthermore, the evidence of your pattern of financially exploiting vulnerable individuals suggests you are precisely the kind of person from whom Mr. Morrison needs legal protection, not legal connection. The judge's final ruling was swift and absolute. Not only was Savannah's petition for parental rights denied, but Judge Williams issued a permanent restraining order preventing her from contacting Stanley in any way. She also referred the case to the district attorney's office for possible fraud charges related to the elder abuse allegations. As the gavel came down, I watched Savannah's last desperate attempt to secure her future crumble into dust. She tried to approach Stanley as we left the courtroom, but the bailiff stopped her before she could get close. "Stanley, please," she called out, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine desperation. "I'm your mother. You can't just throw away family." Stanley paused and turned back toward her voice one final time. "You threw away family 18 years ago," he said quietly. "I'm just making it official." In the months that followed, Stanley's prediction about Savannah proved prophetic. Unable to resolve her financial troubles through legal manipulation, her life fell apart completely. Her husband Richard discovered not only Stanley's existence, but also her history of targeting wealthy clients. He filed for divorce immediately, taking their daughters with him. The district attorney's investigation revealed a pattern of elder abuse spanning nearly a decade. Savannah was eventually charged with multiple felonies and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Her interior design business collapsed, her assets were seized to pay restitution to her victims, and she became a cautionary tale in legal circles about the dangers of financial predators targeting vulnerable individuals. Stanley, meanwhile, continued to thrive. Pathfinder expanded internationally, helping millions of visually impaired people worldwide achieve greater independence. He started a scholarship program for disabled students pursuing technology careers and eventually sold the company for $230 million, using the proceeds to establish a foundation focused on accessibility innovation. As for me, I couldn't be prouder of the man Stanley had become. The baby that Savannah had discarded as damaged goods had grown into someone who changed the world for the better. More importantly, he'd become a person of integrity, compassion, and wisdom, everything his biological mother had never been. Stanley kept one of the recordings from the court case not out of spite, but as a reminder. Sometimes when he's working late at the foundation or struggling with a particularly difficult problem, he plays the part where Savannah suggests having him declared incompetent. "It reminds me," he told me once, "that the people who underestimate us are usually the ones who reveal their own limitations." On Stanley's 21st birthday, we had a quiet celebration at home, just the two of us. As we sat on the back porch of our comfortable house, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. "Any regrets, Grandpa?" Stanley asked, as if reading my thoughts. I looked at this remarkable young man who'd overcome every obstacle life had thrown at him, who'd turned his supposed disadvantage into a superpower that helped millions of others, and who'd faced down the woman who'd abandoned him with grace and intelligence. "Only one," I said. "I regret that your father didn't live to see the incredible man you've become." Stanley smiled, that quiet, confident expression I'd come to love so much. "He sees me, Grandpa, every day and everything I do that makes you proud." In the end, Savannah had been right about one thing. Blood does matter. But she'd completely misunderstood which blood was important. It wasn't the biological connection that made us family. It was the blood, sweat, and tears we'd shed together, building something beautiful from the ashes of abandonment and loss. The real legacy wasn't the money Stanley had earned or the success he'd achieved. It was the proof that love, perseverance, and integrity will always triumph over greed, manipulation, and selfishness, and that was a lesson worth more than all the millions in the world.